I moved to Oakridge Estates because it was supposed to be a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. You know the type: winding streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns, dads in cargo shorts waving over their grills, kids riding their bikes without a care in the world. A place where you didn't have to worry about crime, chaos, or, God forbid, an unapproved mailbox design. At least that's what I thought. The moment we moved in, I started hearing whispers about Margaret Delacroix. The name alone sounded like it belonged to an old money heiress, but in reality, Margaret was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. She wasn't just a stickler for the rules, she was the rules. If there was a regulation to be enforced, Margaret was there with her clipboard, her Botoxed smirk, and an unwavering sense of moral superiority. I had no idea what I was dealing with until the Treehouse. It started as a simple weekend project. My 8-year-old son, Lucas, had been begging for one ever since he saw the sandlot, so I figured, why not? We had a big enough backyard, plenty of sturdy oaks, and I wasn't about to crush his dreams because of a few minor inconveniences, like, say, my complete lack of carpentry skills. So I did what any good father would do. I Googled some plans, bought an obscene amount of lumber, and called my brother-in-law for backup. We spent an entire Saturday hammering, sawing, and swearing under our breath while Lucas supervised with all the authority of a pint-sized foreman. By Sunday evening, we had a fully functional, slightly crooked, but charmingly rustic treehouse, nestled in our backyard. Lucas was ecstatic. Margaret was not. The first sign of trouble came Monday morning, delivered via an aggressively folded letter taped to my front door. Dear Mr. Carter, it has come to my attention that you have constructed an unauthorized structure on your property. Per Oakridge Estates HOA Guidelines, Article 6, Section 12, all external additions must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Please submit an application for retroactive approval immediately, or remove the structure within 7 days to avoid penalties. Sincerely, Margaret Delacroix, HOA President. Now, I don't consider myself a rebel. I'm a reasonable guy. But something about the way she signed that letter, HOA President, like she was some kind of suburban dictator, rubbed me the wrong way. I decided to play nice. I submitted an application that same afternoon. 2 days later, I got my response. Denied. Margaret had attached an entire dossier of reasons why the treehouse was a blight upon the community. It was a safety hazard. It was an eyesore. It disrupted the aesthetic harmony of Oakridge Estates, whatever the hell that meant. She gave me 5 more days to take it down. I did what any rational person would do. I ignored her. And that, as it turns out, was the worst possible thing I could have done. Margaret declared war. First came the fines. $50 a day for failure to comply. Then, the passive-aggressive neighborly pressure. Suddenly, my morning jogs were filled with cold stares and hushed whispers. People who once waved from their porches now avoided eye contact like I was some kind of social leper. Then came the pettiness. My garbage bin started getting accidentally knocked over on trash day. My mailbox was mysteriously tagged with a warning about its non-compliant design. Someone even lodged a complaint about the shade of my front door, claiming it wasn't approved HOA beige, but the treehouse stayed up, and that, apparently, pushed Margaret over the edge. The breaking point came on a warm Thursday evening. I had just put Lucas to bed when I smelled it. Smoke. I ran outside and froze. The treehouse was on fire. Flames licked at the wooden beams, embers crackling in the night air. For a second, I thought maybe it was some freak accident, until I saw her, Margaret Delacroix. She stood at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, watching with the smug satisfaction of a Bond villain. "Margaret!" I shouted, sprinting toward her. "What the hell did you do?" She didn't even flinch, didn't even try to deny it. "I told you, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Non-compliant structures must be removed." I stared at her, stunned beyond words. The woman had just committed arson over a damn HOA violation. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The treehouse was nothing but smoldering embers and shattered dreams. Lucas cried himself to sleep that night. I stayed up, staring at the charred remains, feeling rage coil in my chest like a living thing. Margaret thought she'd won. But what she didn't realize was she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, because in her unhinged power trip, she had overlooked one very important fact. Setting fire to someone else's property? That's a felony, and I was about to make damn sure she paid for it. The first thing I did was call the cops. Now, in theory, this should have been a straightforward case. A woman trespassed onto my property and committed arson. There were scorch marks on my tree, ashes where my kids' dreams used to be, and at least 3 neighbors who had seen the flames. Hell, even the fire report confirmed it wasn't an accident. It should have been open and shut. But Oakridge Estates had a way of twisting reality. When the officers showed up, Margaret was already there, standing in my yard like she owned the damn place. "Good evening, officers," she said, all sugar-sweet politeness, as if she hadn't just set fire to a child's playhouse. "I'm so relieved you're here. This poor man has been struggling with compliance issues for weeks, and I'm afraid it's caused quite a bit of distress." I nearly choked. "Distress? Distress?" I snapped. "You burned down my kid's treehouse." Margaret let out a long-suffering sigh, the kind only the truly self-righteous can master. "Now, Mr. Carter, let's not be dramatic. The structure was a clear violation of HOA regulations, and when you refused to remove it, I took the appropriate action to ensure community safety." I turned to the cops, waiting for one of them to slap the cuffs on this lunatic, but all I got was a pair of exhausted expressions. One of them, Officer Sullivan, rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Look, sir, we understand there was an incident here, but—" "She set fire to my property," I cut in. "That's arson. That's a felony." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that told me she was used to getting away with everything. "Oh, but officer," she crooned, tilting her head in fake innocence, "the HOA has very clear bylaws regarding unauthorized structures. Page 27. Section B, non-compliant additions must be removed promptly. Mr. Carter was given ample notice. I was simply acting in accordance with the regulations." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. One of the officers actually flipped through the HOA handbook like this was some kind of binding legal document. "I don't care about your HOA handbook." I exploded. "You can't just set fire to things you don't like." Officer Sullivan sighed. "Ma'am, did you start this fire?" Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest like she'd been accused of witchcraft. "Of course not. I was simply ensuring compliance. If Mr. Carter had removed the structure himself, this tragic accident never would have happened." I saw it then, the way she chose her words carefully. She never actually admitted to lighting the fire. My stomach sank. This wasn't just about power. Margaret had been playing this game for years, and I had just walked right into it. The cops, predictably, did nothing. They filed a report, told me they'd look into it, and left me standing there, seething, while Margaret waltzed away like she hadn't just committed an actual crime, but she had made one mistake. Margaret thought she was untouchable because she had connections, because she knew how to twist the rules in her favor, but she'd forgotten one thing. The law doesn't give a damn about HOA bylaws, and I had proof. Margaret wasn't the only one who played by the rules. I had read that HOA handbook front to back after her first letter. I knew every petty, ridiculous regulation, but more importantly, I knew something she didn't. See, Oakridge Estates wasn't just a private community. It was a designated historic neighborhood. That meant any structural removal, intentional or accidental, had to be approved by the county. And guess what? Arson didn't qualify. It took me less than 24 hours to file an official complaint with the county's Historic Preservation Board, and that's when things started to unravel. The next morning, Margaret was back. This time, she wasn't smirking. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped, marching up my driveway. I sipped my coffee and smiled. "Oh, you mean the complaint I filed? You know, the one that makes you personally liable for the destruction of a protected structure?" Margaret's face drained of color. "That treehouse was not a protected structure. No, but the oak tree it was built in is." I sat down, my mug. "And since you set fire to a historic tree, congratulations, you're facing county charges." Margaret's nostrils flared. "This is ridiculous." "Oh, is it?" "Because I had a great conversation with the county inspector this morning. Turns out they're very interested in the HOA's history of removing things without proper permits. They also loved the part where you trespassed onto my property and committed felony-level vandalism. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd met her, she had nothing to say. "You're bluffing!" she finally spat. I pulled out my phone and held up an email from the county. Formal investigation opened. Margaret paled. "You overplayed your hand, Margaret," I said, my voice calm. "And now, you're about to find out what happens when you break a rule that actually matters." For the next week, Margaret's world collapsed. The county slapped her with a cease and desist order. The HOA board, once her loyal army of minions, started distancing themselves as her name became synonymous with legal liability. And then, the best part. The cops came back. This time, they weren't so accommodating. When they placed Margaret under arrest for criminal trespass, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment, I made sure to stand on my porch, coffee in hand, smiling as they led her to the squad car. She glared at me, her face contorted with pure rage. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "Oh, Margaret," I said, giving her a mockingly sympathetic look. "It's just getting started." And I meant it, because Margaret had one last lesson to learn. And the best part? She was about to teach it to herself. Margaret was in deep. The county had opened a full investigation into the HOA's enforcement policies, which meant Margaret was now dealing with two separate legal nightmares. One, for setting fire to my kid's treehouse, and another for abusing her power as HOA president. But the real kicker? Her own bylaws were about to destroy her. See, while Margaret had spent years weaponizing HOA regulations against everyone else, she'd never considered what would happen if those same rules turned against her. And that's where things got interesting. After her arrest, the HOA board, her once loyal lapdogs, started panicking. They'd always supported Margaret because she kept things orderly, but with the county breathing down their necks, their own positions were at risk. They needed a scapegoat. And guess who fit the bill? Less than a week after her arrest, the board called an emergency meeting, a vote of no confidence. I made sure to attend. Margaret stormed in, still in denial, her usual air of superiority slightly cracked but not yet broken. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. "Let's get this over with," she snapped, taking her seat. One of the board members, a balding guy named Frank O'Donnell, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Margaret, due to recent events, we've decided to conduct a vote on your position as HOA president." Margaret scoffed. "This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. Everything I've done has been for the good of this community. You—" "Set a fire, Margaret," Frank cut in. "A literal fire." Margaret's eye twitched. "It was a non-compliant structure on private property." Silence. Frank looked around the table. "All in favor of removing Margaret Delacroix from her position as HOA president, raise your hand." Every single hand went up, even her former best friend, Linda. Margaret's face drained of color. You can't do this," she stammered. "I am this HOA." Frank slid a folder across the table. "Per HOA bylaw, Section 14, subsection C. Any president convicted of a criminal act while in office is subject to immediate removal." He looked at her with something almost resembling pity. "You wrote that rule, Margaret." I watched her entire world collapse in real time. "No," she whispered. No, you can't. It's already done." With that, Margaret Delacroix was officially stripped of power. She was still reeling from the shock when Frank delivered the final blow. "Also," he said, "you're being fined for violating HOA rules." Margaret blinked. "What?" "You illegally removed a structure from a homeowner's property without proper authorization," Frank said, flipping through the HOA handbook. "That's a $5,000 fine per incident." I bit back a laugh. Margaret tried to protest, but the irony of the situation was too perfect. She'd spent years enforcing ridiculous fines, and now she was the one being bled dry by her own rules. Her downfall was complete, but karma wasn't quite finished yet. Because just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for Margaret, they did. See, Oakridge Estates had a zero-tolerance policy for criminal convictions. Homeowners with felonies on their record, not allowed, and Margaret was now a convicted felon, which meant she had to sell her house. Margaret tried to fight it. Of course she did. But the bylaws were ironclad. The same ones she'd spent years enforcing on others had finally come back to destroy her. And that was justice. I won't lie. Watching her pack up her perfectly coordinated moving boxes, her face twisted in pure humiliation, was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But the final delicious cherry on top, the house she was forced to sell, it was purchased by a young couple, a couple who, on their very first weekend in the neighborhood, built their kid a brand new treehouse, right in the same spot where Margaret burned down the last one. The best part? This time, the HOA had no say in it, because after Margaret's reign of terror, the entire neighborhood revolted. The new HOA president, good old Frank O'Donnell, spearheaded major reforms, loosened restrictions, killed the nonsense rules, and as a final, brilliant act of poetic justice, the very first change they made, they abolished all restrictions on tree houses. I got an official letter about it, signed, sealed, and framed on my wall. So, in the end, Margaret didn't just lose her power, her house, and her control. She lost the very thing she was fighting against. Because the second she left Oakridge Estates, the neighborhood became exactly what it was always meant to be. A place where kids could just be kids. A place where families didn't live in fear. And most importantly, a place where tree houses were finally, officially, HOA approved.